if you understand how the brain functions, you can actually make anatomical changes in your horse's brain.
Dr. Steven Peters is a former Navy officer and Goldman Sachs banker who became a clinical neuroscientist and one of the foremost experts on how horses' brains work. His research challenges long-held training habits with evidence from neuroscience. Today, you'll hear why young horses have limited attention spans, how fear reshapes the brain, and the 3 essentials every horse and human needs to learn effectively. We'll explore the science of dwell time and how subtle shifts in training can build a smarter, more confident, and more willing horse.
Dear Horse World, it's Dr. Steven Peters.
Well, Steve, welcome to the Dear Horse World podcast.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
I am so excited. Can barely contain my excitement about everything that we're going to talk about in this episode. I want you to share with everybody a little bit of your origin story, because before we pressed record, you shared some parts of your life that I actually was completely unaware of. And I think it's really remarkable for you to share a little bit of what did life look like before you were a neuroscientist?
Probably what people don't know about me, I come from a military family. So when people ask me, well, where do you come from? I've lived in Japan, I've lived in England. We've been all over with a move every few years. I was born in Hawaii when it was still a territory. Even had a horse, Strawberry, in Hawaii, because like every kid who's looking at that black and white TV with rabbit, ear antennas, I watched a steady diet of rawhide and wagon train, etc. And so that's what I thought I really wanted to be all along. I was a Navy officer because my dad was a Navy pilot. So, and the military lifestyle was one I was really comfortable with. So, for 5 years, I was a Navy officer, but I had been dating my wife at the time before she was my wife during that period. And I knew that I would spend a lot of time at sea, and that probably wasn't going to be healthy for a marriage. So she's a New Yorker, a city woman, and I interviewed time and time again, because there's quite a process, at Goldman Sachs investment bank, and I went to work there for about 2 years. My dad, during this time, began to have seizures, and we found out that he had a brain tumor that was terminal, actually, a glioblastoma that just continued to grow. And so I became really fascinated with the brain. And sort of off track even from that is I'm on the autistic spectrum. So when I lock into something, it's with a laser focus, and it's sort of crazy because I can be easily distracted, but at the same time, if I'm focused, then I can just hone in. And I just could not get this idea about brain tumors and how brains function out of my mind. So after a lot of discussion with my then wife, even though I knew I was going to spend at least the next decade learning about brains, it was a passion for me. It was a pretty easy choice. And so that's what drove me into school and practicums and internships and residency and postdoctoral fellowships. And my history from there was I became a clinical neuroscientist, and I'd see patients all the time and assess brain functioning.
Human patients.
Human patients. But nonetheless, that was the lens that I looked at horses through their nervous system. And I saw patterns pretty easily. And I began to see patterns in horses that were related to their nervous system. From there, I thought, but I don't have empirical data. I have 7 horses. Whatever I do with these 7 horses is not going to generalize out to the horse world. And when I would ask people, why do you think your horse did this? They would say, well, they're a right brain introverted Sagittarius. I'd hear all kinds of reasons for why horses did things.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to read all the peer-reviewed literature in veterinary science, animal cognition. I began dissecting out horse brains. But the piece missing was the observation of large numbers. So I found this guy, this cowboy, a 5th-generation cowboy, Martin Black. And we began interacting. And it was fascinating to both of us because what he was seeing, based on thousands and thousands of observations, I could support with the science. And I would say, Martin, do you ever see this? He'd say, how do you know that? Well, I would say, well, because I know how the brain works. And he said, it took me like 1,000 horses, but I see the same thing. And I might say, you see how that facial nerve there gets activated and just sort of sticks out? And he said, oh yeah, you mean that guitar string thing that in their face. Our language was different, but our observations were identical.
Wow.
And when the puzzle pieces started to fit together, that's when Martin said, we can't keep this to ourselves. So we wrote a small book, Evidence-Based Horsemanship, The Scientist and the Cowboy. And the reason it's a smaller book, I had all these citations. And Martin said, what is this? And I said, well, this is all the research to back up. It's evidence-based. I'm not saying anything that's my opinion unless I can support it with evidence. He said, well, who cares about all these citations? I said, well, the scientists do. He said, are we writing this for scientists? Do we want this to end up in some academic library somewhere read by 20 scientists who may not even see a horse? He said, let's just trim all that away. I want this book to fit in somebody's saddlebag.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And,
That's a smart one from Martin. I like that.
Yeah, that was great. What we've done since that time was we've now written our new book, The Science and Practice of Evidence-Based Horsemanship. And that's got all kinds of citations in it. So anybody who wasn't satisfied with the evidence to support all that information, it is chock full of science. You can deep dive as deep as you want. And the practical side, the application, Martin's still not done with that. But the book's still coming out in the fall. In fact, as I was driving here, he texted me, he said, I got one more story. I'm just about done with this, but it's got to be in the book.
Yes.
He wants to put the kitchen sink in the book, everything. So this is probably 5 times as thick as the book that we first did. But this is going to be more of our legacy. And these are where things have evolved to. It took me 3.5 years to gather the evidence and fine tune it for this book. So that's where we are now. And we are, I give clinics.
You do? We just finished one.
Exactly.
It's groundbreaking work. It's unbelievable. Every horse person on the planet should take this course. Both the first and the second one, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. And it's not to do away with tradition. If some people are threatened by that, it's just evolution beyond that. Because if you keep doing the same thing again and again, you're saying it could never be any better. And for me, it becomes really evident when we're working with the nervous system and the brain and when we're working against. And when we work against, that's not good for the rider. It's not in the horse's best interest and will create tremendous stress when it really doesn't have to be there. And you can get so much farther. And I think I tell everyone that if you're just willing to peek through a different lens, it can be so enlightening and give you so much more in your toolbox. And even if you know the how, you can get what you want out of your horse, no matter what. Warwick Schiller told me that, I could make horses do anything I wanted to, but I didn't have a relationship with any of those horses. I didn't have a connection, and I got depressed and I got a clinical depression because I felt like my horses didn't like me. And I went to the reining warm-up pens, and after a while, it looked like every horse was looking at me and making me feel guilty. Get me out of here, Warwick.
Mhm.
And sometimes I feel the same way. We can make horses do whatever we want, but at a cost. And if we're able to work with them, that's where the horse really shows us what's possible.
So first thing I want to ask you is, you've brought up the nervous system, and I know that there's going to be quite a few listeners or people who are watching this episode who are asking, well, Dr. Peters, what does the nervous system have to do with the brain?
It's all a system. Actually, the brain is part of the nervous system, all the way down the spinal cord. But I would say this: there's no perception, no sensation, no reaction. Everything that your horse does, every movement your horse makes, has to go through the brain. So if you're saying that the brain doesn't have relevance, that's the command and control center for everything that's ever going to happen in your horse and every memory. And you may say, well, I've done something, or something's wrong with my horse, and now it's a little embarrassing to acknowledge that. We all do, until we know better, and then we do better. And the cool thing about it is, with a brain, you get a second chance. You can rewire the brain if you know how. If you understand how the brain functions, you can actually make anatomical changes in your horse's brain. Or you can keep guessing, or you can become dominant and force those things, or you can work with your horse in a dialogue, which versus a monologue, a dialogue in which you can fine-tune those connections. And it's amazing where you can get with your horse in terms of speaking their language.
Yes. I think that's what really resonated with me doing the course Equine Neuroscience, the introductory course, and then this advanced course that we just finished. What really landed for me is that every single person in the horse world wants to be able to speak to their horse, right? Everyone says, I want to have this unspoken language with my horse. I want them to understand me, and I want, me to understand them. To understand how their brain works I've come to understand, is a vital component to this. Our horses' brains are different to our brains. And I'm excited for you to explain that to everybody. How are our brains as humans different to horses' brains?
First of all, I preface this by saying, in many ways, they're remarkably similar. And even when you look at them in dissection, if you're not used to seeing brains, you could be fooled by just their size. You may think that a horse brain is a human size.
That's a myth, that the horse's brain is like the size of a walnut. Right?
You've held a brain in your hand.
I have. It's not the size of a walnut, everybody.
Yeah. But the differences are, there's some sort of misnomer going around out there that the horse doesn't have a frontal lobe. All horses have frontal lobes. All mammals have frontal lobes. It's just that frontal lobe has evolved to meet the niche that the horse falls into evolutionarily, so that it works best for their survival. It's true, they don't have a large mass of tissue dedicated to frontal lobe type functions. Our frontal lobes make up about 1/3 of our brain.
Wow.
Right? Where theirs is much, much smaller. They use their frontal lobe, some of its motor cortex that just leaks over. So those are motor neurons in the frontal regions, but many of those connections are related to attention. So the horse's attention is a frontal lobe focus. How important is that in your work with horses? You can't learn anything without attention.
And I really want you to speak to how horses' attention develops as per their age. That really blew my mind.
Horses are born needing, if you think of what sense does a horse need to survive immediately when they pop into the world? They've got to get on their feet and they've got to move.
Yes.
And so the cerebellum, which is related to balance, sequencing, fine motor movement, that's starting to get myelinated. And I'll talk in a minute about myelination. And the motor cortex. So you'll see foals stretching in crazy positions. You'll watch them leap in the air and they don't know where they're going thought-wise when they reach the ground again. Then they pogo stick off somewhere else. But it doesn't take long until they're smoothly moving right along in step with their mom. That's because every time a motor neuron fires, it creates excitement in the brain, and these other cells arrive and start to wrap this fatty wrapping, this insulation called myelin, around that neuron, making them more efficient and faster. A naked neuron sends messages about 2 miles an hour, and some of that leaks off. But when you get myelinated, we're talking about on the impact of 200 miles an hour, and the message doesn't become diffuse over time. So these are clear messages, fast messages, and that's where the horse myelinates. But the horse's frontal lobe that they use for attention, that area is not really even beginning to be addressed until they're 2, 3, 4 years old. So if they're using that area of the brain for attention, we often are asking horses before they're 2, horses at 2, horses in futurities. We demand attention in our training, and especially if we do this over long periods of time. We wouldn't dream of taking an 8-year-old kid and sticking them in a 3-hour college lecture and telling them not to fidget and pay attention.
But that's what we're doing when we ask 8-year-old horses.
Exactly what we're doing. And if you see some horses can do that, they're the freaks.
Right. They're this abnormal, from a neuroscience point of view, they're abnormal.
And really their emotional and psychological being has to be able to do that, to pay attention in those situations. And so that makes that ratio of horses to those that can do it even smaller. What happens to those other horses? That's kind of wastage. That's kind of thought of as, well, that's the price you pay to get to the top of the pyramid.
Those 8-year-olds that can sit in college lectures.
Yes, exactly.
So for everyone who's listening and watching, you got a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are starting their own horses or who are part of the starting of their own horses. And across different disciplines in the horse world, everyone has a different age benchmark, right? So in more show jumping and more the Olympic disciplines, we start them later. We don't do futurities at that level. But then you look at the racehorse industry, those horses are racing big industry races at very, very young ages. So could you give some benchmarks to everybody about when is that frontal lobe? When can we expect to have a healthy level of attention from a young horse?
Right. So this doesn't mean you don't handle your horse when they're a 2-year-old, but what we need to do is then realize that their attention has a limited capacity. So you work with that. So you could do very small, short, brief periods, which actually works better than long, drawn-out repetitions. But that long, drawn-out repetition that requires long periods of attention, we are often dealing with a brain that's not capable of doing that, yet we're asking it. And when we don't get it, we become more controlling to try to force it. And what happens is you make changes in the neurochemistry, and the horses become more sympathetically aroused, and they'll either check out on you, they can become aggravated, or worse yet, they get confused, more sympathetically aroused. Now you're seeing behaviors that you don't necessarily want. And so why would you push the horse into that position to behave in that way when you can work with the nervous system and avoid that altogether, because that you're just going to have to go back and fix those fights that you put in there in the long run, or you're going to end up in this back and forth contest with the horse. I think it was Ray Hunt that said you don't want to contest your horse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ray also said the slower you go, the faster you learn.
Boy, he had a pretty good handle on this.
So when you talk about, because I'm picturing in my mind, okay, so you're asking a young horse to go beyond their neurological capacity, right? And then they have either in those situations where maybe that person's not their training is not neuroscience informed, right? They don't understand how the brain works. So they're expecting that 3-year-old to give them a long training session. So that horse has a couple of options, right? They can either fight back because they'll become more sympathetically aroused.
So fight or flight.
Or flight.
So fight is an option. Most all the time, the horse is going to take flight.
Right. That's their choice.
That's their number one choice for the most part.
Yeah. Or they'll fight back, or this is, from the sounds of it, this is the birth of, or what I would call the makings of learned helplessness.
Yeah. If you try something and you can't escape the pain, so you might want to go to flight first. And this can be emotional pain. This could be psychological pain. It doesn't have to be physical pain. But if we take flight away from you, then the horse may turn to fight. Right? If the horse doesn't turn to those two options, oftentimes what they'll do is what's called a parasympathetic crash. They'll just check out totally, and they can go to a freeze response. A true freeze response is, humans feel it too. You know, if somebody assaults you and they're too big for you to fight, and you can't run away, they're holding on to you. Oftentimes you say, something horrendous is going to happen to me, so horrendous that I don't want to be there for it, and you check out. You dissociate.
Right. So disassociation is something we see in people and in horses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the way we protect ourselves.
So can you make a horse smarter, and can you make a horse dumber?
Absolutely. Absolutely. With any mammal, I could take them and put them in an environment, one, where they feel safe, where they're able to get motivated, get dopamine on their own with an internal locus of control. They may run a maze, they may have treadmills, but they're with other animals of their species. And if after 6 months I were to look at those brains, I would find all kinds of axonal connections and growth, like a tree arborizing, growing limbs. I could take the same animals and I could isolate them from other animals, just put them in their own pen without any other stimuli, and they're fed, they're taken care of, they're fed.
Their primary needs are, quote unquote, met.
But if I look at those brains after 6 months, I'll find none of that arborization. It's like I've gone in with shears and trimmed off limbs and branches. I've done pruning. In fact, it's referred to as axonal pruning. And I can end up with a brain that doesn't have those same connections. And I could do even worse. I could totally isolate the animal, like in a cinder block enclosure, no other animals around. This would be a sensory deprivation box. And we have those in the horse world. They're called box stalls, where the nature is to be able to use your senses to see onto the horizon at long distances. Well, I'll become nearsighted if the only messages my eyes are receiving are the sides of the stall. If I'm not moving around, then my motor strip's not going to function the same way. If somebody shaves my vibrissae, which are tactile sensors, we call those whiskers, right? Mares shouldn't have whiskers. right? So that's a cosmetic, eh, you know, human deal. But if you're not, over time, not receiving messages down those vibrissae and into your brain, which tell you where you are in space, then once the brain doesn't receive information, it becomes less effective once it does. So when those hairs grow back, if you've cut them for a long period of time, you've sort of silenced a sense. I mean, think about that. Here's a sense that needs to get to the brain, and you've made it silent. They use those to explore with. If I chopped off your fingers, right? Chopped off the fingers of a blind pianist, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they are sensory creatures. That's the way to think of the horse, is that they're sensing things that you absolutely cannot imagine. As humans, we use our own brain as sort of comparison. And that makes sense because that's the only kind of brain you have. You have a human brain. You haven't been studying brains all along. And so you use that. But if you stop and think of your world and think of their world, they have almost a 340-degree panoramic view. They see the world out there, and those eyes are sensitive to motion. So any little motion out there gets picked up quickly, and a predator should be designed like that. When it gets dark, they can see when you're trying to look in the dark because they have rods, and rods bring in more light. We have more cones. So color and clarity for us is, and if we look straight ahead, that's what we'll see. For them, the world's blurry and it doesn't have the same colors in it.
Yep.
And they're seeing things that you can't see because they're seeing back behind their head.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And you can go over each and every sense, their sense of smell. You took a look at the giant olfactory bulbs of horses and saw how large those are. And you can tell how important something is in a brain by either its location or its size. The big things are a cerebellum and olfactory bulbs. Olfactory bulbs are smell. So when they're sniffing that saddle pad, they're not sniffing the saddle pad. They could smell that far away. They're likely rubbing their vibrissae on it, then using those prehensile lips to investigate, and maybe even holding it in their teeth a little bit to investigate, but they're certainly not smelling it.
They had that on lockdown way before you even put the saddle pad near them.
Absolutely.
Something that you said to me that really blew my mind was when we put horses in box stalls and we deprive them of the natural sensory information that they need, that their species has evolved from, that they can actually become nearsighted.
And that makes sense. You can do this with cats. They've done this with all kinds of mammals. When you take away a sense and it doesn't register in the brain anymore, those neurons don't necessarily go fallow. Just other areas of the brain start to use them, so they're no longer available.
So when we take, and our regulatory bodies have now made it, illegal for us to clip the vibrissae. But I grew up clipping whiskers or vibrissae like all throughout my junior years as a rider. So now I think, oh well, we started to see horses bump into things, or they go, oh, so and so horse like cut their face again in the stall. Well, it's because we've taken away, it's like not giving someone who can't, like taking someone's glasses away, right?
Those vibrissae are in blind spots.
Right.
So that nail in the manger that they may have sensed previously, now we get increased lip trauma or eye trauma. And you're right, you put them in an unfamiliar round pen and they're banging their face. Watch them use those vibrissae with an electric fence. They know exactly how close they can get. So those are such fascinating structures. The military uses something similar for robots, where they use sensors to tell the robot where they are in space. And the technology is built on our horses' incredible sense. That's the model. Yet we decide we're going to trim it off because we don't think it looks
We don't like the way it looks.
cosmetically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something that happened yesterday, and it was so fascinating because throughout this studying with you, I've learned a lot about how horses see and how they register and gain information from the depth and like the dimensions of things. And because their eyes are not like ours, they don't collect that data through their eyes the same way that we do. So yesterday, when I was crossing bridges with my mare, I had this light bulb moment because she actually, as an Appaloosa, she actually has, she's always gonna, well, in her case, back supported by Dr. Dennis Brooks, who we love. We're gonna do a shout out for Dr. Dennis Brooks. He's helped me understand how Lady sees and how her eyesight as an Appaloosa has a few more challenges to it. So she's had some uveitis flare-ups, she's had some ulcers. So she actually has to work harder. And you and Dennis have brought this together for me to understand that she moves a lot. So she'll move her head around a lot. And I used to interpret that as not defiance, but she is quite an opinionated horse. And so she'll often act quite strongly if she doesn't feel safe. And yesterday, I noticed that we would come to a bridge. She needs to look at it. Not only does she need to drop her head down, which some of us think our horses are smelling the ground. But now that I understand the way that horses smell, they're not smelling the ground. They smelt it from when you were walking up to the trailer. What they're doing is they're understanding where the ledge of that, the gradient of that ramp. But what she was doing yesterday totally clicked for me. She was actually looking like she was looking behind, but actually knowing that she has, she doesn't have perfect vision, but she doesn't have completely compromised vision. I actually think that what she was trying to do is she was trying to really take in all of the dimensions of that bridge because she needs extra information because she doesn't see as well as maybe my other horse, Galano.
Absolutely. The ciliary muscles in their eyes are weaker, and it takes them a while to adjust. Right in front, where the vision from the two eyes meet, they have binocular vision. That's their depth perception. So oftentimes they'll put their head down to fall within that range of binocular vision. Where are you likely to see it? Crossing a stream, going over a bridge. Sometimes we take that away from them. If you're in a steeplechase and you hold their head in a position, they're not able to put their head in a way that keeps it within binocular vision. You go to the back of the trailer, oftentimes they'll put their head down, especially if it's one of those step-up trailers, because they want to see how high they need to step. If we don't want their head down and we yank it up and take vision away from them, they're blindly going onto that trailer. They bang their legs because they don't know how high to step. And now, where did this trailer loading problem come from? Well, we took away a sense when they would have helped us to climb aboard. They totally relied on us. And I think we need to take responsibility for the times that we cause our horses difficulty when we ask them to do things they're not capable of when we remove one of their senses.
Yes. So it made me think of blinders in a completely new way when I thought about horses, because horses actually, and the more and more I observe Lady, the more and more I realize that she really has to work to take in a lot of visual information, and she might take longer to do that, right? She's older and she does have compromised vision. So if I yank her head up because I think that she's not paying attention to what I want her to do, and what really solidified that after, because I had some dwell time after my ride yesterday, was, and we're going to talk about dwell time, was when I was at Craig Cameron's and she did her first Cowboy Challenge course. He had us, and this is again where the cowboy wisdom meets the science. He was like, I want you to walk both sides, circles around every obstacle. I don't want you to go over it. I just want you to circle around it and really let your horses get a look at every aspect, every corner of that bridge or that pedestal or whatever it was that we were doing. He had us circle a couple times around one way and then the other, and then leave. And then go look at another part of the course. So then when we went and actually did the course, the horses had no problem. because he had really set us up to like introduce each of the obstacles. And I thought that was fascinating understanding the science now, because what he's doing is he's allowing the horse to take in information on the height, the depth, the dimension of everything that we're doing. And then I think, how many times have I jumped courses on horses? How many times have I gone into new environments and the horses don't get any chance to take in any information? They're just asked to go straight, which is actually not, and their head has to be straight, but that's not necessarily how they see.
Providing them with information and giving them time to process the information is so important. You looked at it and making the assumption that information is being processed, but if they're on to the next thing, now you have more competing information coming into the brain before the brain has time to process what they've been exposed to. And then we do it again, and then we do it again. And the horse is left with fragments to put together themselves because they haven't had the opportunity to consolidate that and start to lock that information away accurately.
When we say neurons that fire together, wire together, can you explain what that means and the science behind it?
Absolutely. Without getting too science-y, because really, that's not what I ever want to do. I want to give information that has real-world application. You can learn some big words, but I want to share information that people can take back to their horse. And I always say, I'm not making this up. Just ask your horse, right? So this is how this works. You and your horse have a neurotransmitter called glutamate. It's the major excitatory neurotransmitter in your system and in your horse's. So if you move your right arm, you're firing glutamate neurons all the way up to your left motor cortex. So if we do something new, then we're firing a new pattern. Glutamatergic neurons will fire in a new pattern if we're doing something new. If we do it a second time, then we're sending information down that same new pathway. We do it quite a few times. What happens is, and here's your $10 word for the day, oligodendrocytes will arrive on the scene. They get excited by this firing and will begin to wrap that, as we had discussed earlier, that neuron in myelin. So by firing, neurons that fire together get wired together. And that starts out like a little feeder road. And then you keep working that. And I don't mean by rote drilling, and we'll talk about why that doesn't work. But over time, you keep firing that new pattern of neurons, and you're essentially paving a highway. You start out like a footpath, and then a small country road, and then you get the myelin, and now it becomes a highway, and information very easily, rapidly, quickly follows that new highway. So getting back to what you had asked way back in this podcast was, can you make your horse smarter? You can certainly wire the brain, and you can rewire these pathways, and you can take existing neural networks and wire them together. So it's amazing how smart your horse can get and how much they want to learn if we provide them with the foundation and we provide them with the architecture in their brain. And that's you learning to, almost like a welder, learning to go in and wire those connections that you want. But if you have your horse in the wrong state, then those messages are not going to take your new feeder road. They're going to go to areas of the brain like the amygdala, an area of the brain associated with fear. So if you're forcing things to happen, you're sending more of those messages not down the highway that you're creating. You're sending them to another area of the brain that's related to fear, and now you're going to get fear responses. And there's no way that pattern of neurons is going to fire when they're under the influence of cortisol and neurotransmitters we haven't talked about yet, norepinephrine, that will send them a different way. And if they're afraid and you keep training, you're going to train that fear right into the task that you're trying to accomplish. And there's not a lot of learning that's going to take place. You're going to deal with emotional side effects.
Yes.
And you put them in there. You put them in there, not your horse. Your horse is really pretty much your construction project when we're talking about the brain.
So something that I learned from you is that the amygdala is also attached to memory. So fear, and this makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, the fear part of the brain is attached to the memory part of the brain. So if we train, like you can see how quickly we get into trouble if we use fear-based training, because those horses, we wire or we pave the wrong highways, right? That we want to be paving highways that have positive association, that have the right chemicals associated with them. I want you to explain the science behind repaving, because this is something that I've done with my mare. And your work helped me understand this 100-to-1 ratio. That when you have a horse that has been traumatized, or you have a horse that's experienced a lot of fear-based training, or you have a horse that's been in a state of self-preservation for a large part of their life, you have highways that you have to very slowly, and one of the only things that you really have to work with is time, because time is like the only way to do 100-to-1. If you're also honoring the neuroscience of learning and dwell time, the only thing that's going to repair those maybe less supportive highways in their brain is time.
Right.
So can you explain how we rewire and this 100-to-1 ratio?
And the 100-to-1 ratio is not always 100-to-1,
right?
But what you're talking about is a rehab horse, basically. And to rehab that horse, we may need 100 good experiences to make up for the one bad. So first of all, let's talk about the architecture in the brain, where the amygdala, which is Latin for almond, because early neuroanatomists thought it looked like an almond, and it actually is at the tip of the hippocampus, Greek for seahorse, because it looks like that. So our almond is attached to our seahorse, and our seahorse's memory, the hippocampus is memory. So if I'm a Vietnam veteran and I feel I'm going to die and I see some horrendous things, then my amygdala is going to supercharge my memory, my hippocampus. Now, when it works efficiently, things that are going to harm us, we remember those so we don't put ourselves in harm's way. But if I supercharge that amygdala, I'm ending up with a memory I can now no longer forget. So if I'm the Vietnam vet walking on the beach in the hot sand and the palm fronds are blowing in the wind and the news helicopter flies over, now I am right back in Vietnam. Not something like it. Somatically, my system is responding as if I were. Okay, now let me use the example of my horse Comet, that I needed a lot of good experiences to get to be able to make progress. So Comet was a beautiful paint horse running around in a herd with a lot of other horses on a big acreage. Comet's owner could not catch her. So he and his friends devised a chute, and so they put up panels to create a chute. They ran her around till she was tired. Finally, she chose the chute. They ran her to the end of the chute and closed her in a small pen. What we've got going on now is flight has been removed. That was her first choice, just run away. But now she can't. She's in a small pen. He went in and she started to rear up. He got frightened, so he got a whip, and as she reared up, he would whip at her, so she began to paw at him, and it scared him. He got out of the pen, and on his way out, he punched her. And I said, what were you teaching her there? That's for all the times I've tried to catch her and for all the crap that she's given me. So in terms punishment plays no role. There's no study out there that shows punishment as an effective learning strategy. So I bought Comet and got her out of there. And whenever a human came close to her, she would rear and paw. So she was flooded with a neurochemical called norepinephrine, highly aroused. She was immediately in fight or flight, immediately in fight. She couldn't help this because those neurons wired together. So any sense that she was in danger sent the messages down that pathway. So I like to call this the signal to noise ratio, right? The signal is our relevant information and our noise is irrelevant information. And if she's so fearful, she can never hear my signal. She's just too concerned with all the noise around. So my job is not necessarily to train, it's to start those good experiences. So it took me a long time to creep towards her pen, to creep towards the round pen, and she'd start to get aroused and start to move and start to run and then get in the back of the pen, and I knew she was ready to go up and start this rearing. This is built in. This is not a conscious decision. This is not a bad horse deciding to do this. This is where the messages are going to go when we're in that emotional state. So over time, I was able to develop some bit of a relationship, but I still had to approach her from the side, not head on, because that's the trigger that would cause this problem. Now I have to change the chemistry. I'm draining off the norepinephrine, and I have to find a way, because we need motivation for learning. Attention, safety, and motivation. So I needed her feeling safe. I needed her attention. That was no problem. She was really focused on anything that was a threat. But I had to find dopamine. And to get dopamine, oftentimes you have to move towards something.
Dopamine is the motivating
Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's related to reward and movement. And nature may have set it up that way. You have to move to a new pasture. You have to move and look over the hill so you can see if there are other mares over there, whatever. So, and people with Parkinson's disease who have less dopamine, it's a neurodegenerative disease where they have less dopamine on board, their movement's affected. They shuffle.
Right.
So movement and reward are closely tied. So if I were to introduce something to Comet that came from the outside externally and caused her to just stand and tolerate what I was presenting, she would rear. I knew that pathway would fire. So I had to develop some curiosity. So I held things away from her so she would have to investigate. Now she's moving toward. And then when she's able to say, okay, that's safe, she gets more serotonin. She gets less norepinephrine. Serotonin is emotional balance, right? Serotonin is related to most of all of our antidepressants. When you get low serotonin, you get selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac. So she was becoming more emotionally balanced. I was reducing the noise, and she started to become curious. Once that was happening and she felt safe enough to explore, she came out of her shell. But I had to give her small successes, small releases. And I want to be clear on this point. A release is when you take the cue off, when you take the pressure off. Relief is when your horse actually feels it. Sometimes you can release, but if your horse doesn't feel it, they're not getting the reward.
They're not getting the chemicals they need to learn.
Right.
So the three components, this is so important. I want to really reinforce this. The three fundamental ingredients for horses to learn.
And humans
to learn. Yes. And this is important for everybody. There's a lot of examples, and I even have a few myself, of when I didn't have these three in my learning in my horsemanship journey. And I didn't learn. And then my trainers would get frustrated with me. But if we don't feel safe, if we don't have motivation, and the third one is?
Attention.
If we don't have our attention. So attention is norepinephrine.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, attention is acetylcholine,
Right.
right? But norepinephrine is our neurochemical of arousal.
Right.
And this is a key point, is if we are afraid of norepinephrine and we start to see our horse get sympathetically aroused and we say, oh, they're out of their comfort zone, this is not a good thing. I don't want you to think that a horse has to just stay in that comfortable homeostatic range, because learning's not optimum there.
Right.
You need to be challenged, right? Kids with their head down on the back of the desk may feel safe in the classroom sleeping, right? And they may have found something else motivating, but you don't have their attention. So you need that level of arousal. People, I think, have tended to look at the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, right? Parasympathetic is rest and digest. But there's a balance. One's not good, one's not bad. We need the sympathetic nervous system to learn. We have to be aroused enough to focus our attention, and we get our biggest dopamine hits with that high level of arousal.
Yes.
If you go too far, the idea is you have to let the horse reset and come back down before you go back and apply more pressure. Vital.
Well, and this learning from you has made me realize, I used to think, and I think a lot of the way that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, or our autonomic nervous system, has been presented visually. It's like a bubble over here and a bubble over here. But in actual fact, it's more like a Venn diagram where there's a crossover and there's this beautiful optimal area of learning. And also there could be, like we talked about already, the parasympathetic crash. So when a horse freezes or goes into learned helplessness, that is parasympathetic crash. That is not there. That's not sympathetic. That's full parasympathetic crash. So there are bad stages. There's also there's a too far in the parasympathetic as well, which is so important. So
so freeze, right? The freeze response is a parasympathetic response. Your heart rate decreases. You feel like you're going to faint when it happens with humans. It's a vasovagal type of response. So you can't look. Sex is sympathetic. Play is sympathetic.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff happens up there
in the sympathetic nervous system.
Right.
So we can't think of it as like good and bad. We have to think about it as, what are you trying to achieve? And homeostasis is where we hopefully spend a lot of time, because that's fundamentally a resting state, right?
Homeostasis is your biological balance, where your heart rate is normal, your respiratory rate is normal. And homeostasis is really, this is a key operative term, self-regulation of your biological balance. So when you come out of that with changing circumstances, your ability to come back down to homeostasis, self-regulating. So it's up to us to optimize that system. So when we take our horse out of homeostasis, we want to show them that there's a way down, and it's highly rewarding to come back down into that homeostatic state, and they'll be hunting for it. So this is what we use. We get high arousal for a short amount of time. That's where we get the optimum attention, acetylcholine. That's where we have the right level of norepinephrine.
Yeah.
Right. And all horses are different.
Be like kind of like an orange, because like if you were to think of homeostasis as green and sympathetic or hyperarousal as red,
right,
then it's kind of like this orange zone.
They're gradients. And the more time you spend in that middle gradient, where you kind of have a mix of hot water and cold water, the more time you spend there, it becomes harder to become threatened, because that window opens and you're used to swimming in those waters. For example, if I never take my horse out of the arena, right, then their sort of window of what they will tolerate is very small.
Very narrow.
Homeostasis is, I'm in the arena. So if I just come out one step, I may now become sympathetically aroused. So let's play with that. Let's go a little bit down the trail. I see you're a little worked up. Let's make a couple circles and maybe we'll come back. Because if you say it's too windy, I can't do it with other horses, the leaves are blowing, whatever reason you start avoiding things, then once you're exposed to those, I mean, if you've never cantered and your horse has never cantered with somebody on their back, and then once that happens, if they don't have neural exercises to help them become comfortable with that and put that within their window of tolerance, then the potential for coming apart, it came out of nowhere. Well, if we put you in the deep end and you've never swam in the deep end, you'll panic.
So neuroscience can actually explain, as we make the optimal window of learning wider, because we offer more opportunities to learning new things, horses learn and they build a pattern recognition that they become sympathetically aroused, but they have just the right amount of norepinephrine and acetylcholine,
Right.
which is attention and focus.
Yes.
But then they can come back down and receive serotonin in homeostasis, which is why we give them a rest. We ask, we challenge, and then we come back down to a place of rest, because serotonin is the emotional balance chemical, and they get that in homeostasis.
Right.
Got it. So this is how neuroscience can explain that when someone says, oh, they have a schoolmaster, or they have that really experienced ranch horse, or what I've experienced with my horses crossing the country, having all these different challenges, they learn something new, but they come back to homeostasis. So they receive their serotonin, and then that window, that orange window, becomes bigger and bigger
Wider and wider and wider. So their optimal learning bracket increases over time. The importance of letting them come back to homeostasis when they're at that high level, when they have sympathetic arousal enough that we're optimizing attention, acetylcholine, dopamine, reward, norepinephrine, arousal. That's where they're focused in on the information. We need to come back to homeostasis because it's in the homeostatic state that it gets consolidated. So they have to come back there. That's their dwell time. We're leaving them alone with no external distractions. Even when you go over at a boy and you slap on him, the brain is having competing signals coming in when it's trying to consolidate information. Basically, you want to back away, give your horse space, get that licking and chewing, and we know that the brain is replaying that information. How do we know that? Well, we take a human being and we put him in a functional MRI tube, and we are functional MRI, by the way, is a neural imaging device that looks at the brain in real time. So if we put somebody in an MRI scanner and they do a task, maybe it's a motor task, so they're using let's say if they're right-handed, they're like your horse, it's wired the same way. They're using their right hand, so their left motor strip is lit up. Now they just lie after the task, still in that neuroimaging device, but we're still imaging. What we'll see is the hippocampus will light up, memory, and replay that same pattern of neuronal firing, although the person's just laying flat. But the brain is still replaying that whole pathway. If I leave them alone even longer, they start to associate with other things that are related to that. Oh, I've done something like this before. Or, yeah, this reminds me of such and such. Now we're creating combining of previous information into our network.
Wow.
But I can ruin all this. I could walk over to that scanner and say, how you doing in there? And pat them on the leg, and it goes blank. So the idea is once you're exposed to information, you need that reflection. You need that dwell time. I mean, old-time waddies used to know that. You hear it called dwell time, but you need that to consolidate the information. When your horse starts blinking and licking and chewing.
It's why Martin says, let's go let him soak on that.
Absolutely.
Old cowboys had terms for it,
They
right?
did.
But they had developed their understanding of the science through just repetition, tons and thousands of horses. But I've literally heard Martin say, okay, let's let them go soak on that for a minute. And they leave them alone, no stimulus, they're not touching them, they're not fussing over them, they're not constrained. Those horses just get to go literally soak in all those chemicals.
You cannot, if the hippocampus replays something 20 times and 20 times faster and is replaying the best that you can do at that, if you kept drilling, you could not do it as well as the hippocampus, because what'll happen is